I have the great honor to introduce Kate Klonick as the moderator of our first fireside panel, fireside chat. This chat is the Tech Year in Review. Kate Klonick is an associate professor of law at St. John's University and an affiliate fellow at the Information Society Project at Yale Law School. She's also a non-resident fellow at Brookings Institution, and for the 2022 and 23 year, she'll be in residence as a visiting scholar at Harvard University's Rebooting Social Media Initiative. Please join me in welcoming Kate, who will welcome Justin Hendricks.
Thank you so much for having me. Justin and I were sitting up here bantering back and forth about who's supposed to be interviewing who. It is, and Sandra says that it is so that I'm the moderator. So I think that I get to interview you, Justin.
We'll see how that goes.
Okay. Justin Hendricks is a CEO and editor of Tech Policy Press, a new nonprofit media venture concerned with the intersection of technology and democracy. Usually he's interviewing me because I come on his podcast or something, so hence the confusion. But I think that this is going to be a fun conversation. We kind of like loosely sketched it out last night.
Yes, we're going to go back and forth. So maybe you won't know who's interviewing who. It'll be like that.
So I think that kind of what we started talking about last night that we thought was kind of interesting and was something that we hadn't heard a lot of.
Should we explain how we ended up on this stage together?
Oh, you can do that.
Well, no, so if anyone doesn't know, Nora Benavides was meant to be with us today and isn't with us. And Kate very kindly stepped in at the last moment, very last moment. So we've had almost no preparation. So to some extent, this is hot takes with Justin and Kate.
Yeah.
We'll see how it goes. We've little preparation, but that's how we ended up here.
So anyway, so like, I guess our first hot take was kind of what is happening with the landscape of cooperation between social science and academic research and civil society and basically the public, I would say, and tech platforms, and what has basically happened in the last couple of months, like the last year, I would say months. And what it has meant with the layoffs, the downturn, the privatization of Twitter, for all of those, for all of us. And we've all seen kind of the headlines of the massive layoffs. But one of the things that I think I have heard a lot of, just talking to people in the field and that have been laid off or are close to these types of issues in particular, is that there has just been a decimation, in particular of tech company support of programs that did academic support. And that's everything from Twitter closing its API to kind of, Jigsaw, YouTube, Google, all of these places having any type of teams that are working on academic cooperation or working on safety or ethics around the products that they're building. Are you hearing similar things?
Yeah, so I think one of the interesting things, I was actually having a conversation last week with Jeff, who edits the Trust and Safety, online Journal of Online Trust and Safety. And we were talking about this gathering that happened in Silicon Valley, which you were at last year. There were multiple kind of events that all happened kind of right around the same time. This digital trust and safety partnership gathered, the Trust and Safety Professionals Association gathered, the Integrity Institute. Jeff, I think you all had some sort of event or you were there. And then there was a research conference also at Stanford. And so it sort of felt like right there in Palo Alto, the world was abuzz with trust and safety. Everyone was doing it. We're all going to make the world a better place, et cetera. And now looking back, 6 months later, maybe that was the high watermark, right? Or maybe that's a negative way to put it. Maybe that was the sort of, turning point or kind of the highest moment of commitment among the tech firms broadly to trust and safety issues, because what's happened after that, right? We've seen Elon decimate the ranks of trust and safety at Twitter, all the things that you just mentioned. We've seen people who've lost jobs at places like Meta. We've seen, other kind of retrenchment and changes across the tech industry. So it's not clear right now. I know there are some folks from the tech industry who are here in the room. They might want to argue with this. TikTok, for instance, just put out a new API, researcher API, last week. YouTube has a new one as well. There's still some moves afoot, right, to kind of improve access, improve the opportunity for academics to study these platforms. And yet, just like what you say, I kind of see the same thing.
Yeah, it actually kind of looks to me, and I've said this to a few people, and it's landed well. People seem to like identify with them. Like, do you think that we were kind of in this golden age of accessibility to the platforms that we didn't quite realize or have appreciation for? We were kind of, there's this, I think I'm allowed to mention him. Louis C.K. has this bit that he did on Conan once that was kind of like talking about flying in an airplane, and he's flying in an airplane, the guy next to it, and he's like this miracle of flight. I'm flying across the entire country at 18,000 feet, and I'm on the internet, and the guy next to me is on the internet, and all of a sudden the internet goes out. The guy slams his laptop shut and starts screaming at the stewardess, and he's like, so quickly we feel entitled to something. Like, so quickly we like think that, like, you know, that we have the, you know, everything is great and nobody's happy type of thing. And I feel a little bit like someone just cut the Wi-Fi on my airplane. With all of this type of stuff. I want to just be really clear with this analogy, though. I want to say that what is really true about this last 5 years of like kind of a rise in social planner mode, as like the economists would call it, like not actually being in bottom line and putting teams together to work on ethics or transparency or cooperating with social scientists. It is, as Katie kind of pointed out about the oversight board and other types of things, they're all incredibly voluntary. They're all completely voluntary. And that's why they're gone now. And we failed to kind of put legislation in place that would make them mandatory, or we failed to keep them around for long enough that they became normative enough that getting rid of them would cause so much outrage that there would be repercussions for it. And I think that those two things are really kind of important to highlight, that we're so busy kind of complaining about it, which is, you know, that they weren't giving us a note, we needed more access, or we needed that, which I don't begrudge all of those things, but we didn't focus on kind of locking it down and making it not discretionary.
Yeah, absolutely. And actually, Katie and I were talking about this just before. I won't, too much about what we went on about, but we were talking about the fact that, Platform Accountability and Transparency Act, which Jamil brought up, why couldn't that push through? What is the reason that there seems to be a kind of a holdup? Why wasn't there more focus on? There was a Digital Services Oversight and Safety Act in the House from Lori Trahan, which was actually very similar in some ways to the Digital Services Act in Europe, had a lot of the same types of ideas, made it nowhere, right? Why won't these things move forward? And part of it may be somewhat cynical politics about who exactly gets access to that information and what will they use it for? What will be the political sort of dynamics that will emerge when you give a bunch of liberal academic institutions the opportunity to study the physics of the social media platforms? What does that end up, who does that end up helping? Who does it end up hurting?
Yeah, I mean, I think the techlash amongst politicians and the politicization of techlash, like I would say, is probably one of my most cynical issues. I think I rarely talk about it because I'm sometimes like afraid that I'll go on this rant, but I will just say that one of the things that really I think is why can't we have PATA? Like, why isn't that, which is Platform Accountability and Transparency Act, why isn't that happening? Well, there are a couple of reasons. One is that there is the appearance of everyone being against the big tech companies, but actually these big, it's called, political scientists call it the horseshoe effect. It's like you go so far to the left or so far to the right, it looks like people are aligned in this issue, but actually they're coming to it from very different reasons and for very different purposes of what they want. And so you have MAGA kind of conservatives wanting to have a must-carry provision to regulate big tech and make them keep everything up. And you have kind of progressive people on like the left who are trying to basically make it so that there is more incentive or there is more liability for platforms to take down and create more safety and remove more speech from platforms. And so both of that falls under this very blanket concept of regulating big tech. Both of those are very different types of things. In fact, it's even more specific. Both of those ideas, which are very different outcomes, are both tied to reform Section 230 efforts. And so there is this false promise of reforming Section 230, and they both get to wave this flag. And and this is where I get really cynical, they both get to wave this flag. They both get to both sides get to stand on the floor, make angry speeches about everything big tech is doing to you, then clip that post it on their own Facebook platform and Twitter
Fundraise with it.
to fundraise it.
Yeah.
This is my favorite, was when all the outrage, like the outrage mongering was happening. And then they were like, outrage, outrage, outrage. They're taking advantage. They're making us angry. They're sowing dissent. And then it would be these like politicians on the floor screaming and then clipping it on the platforms and putting it on the platforms. And I just kind of felt it's not, listen, even if the platforms are doing outrage, even if there are intelligent conversations to be had about why as a society outrage compels us, there are intelligent conversations to be had about how we do that. But what drove me crazy about that moment was that I knew that none of those politicians, because of the political climate, were ever going to have to actually vote on anything and be held accountable for any of the promises they were making, because they could just make the promises. They knew there was no majority. And so they could just make the promises and fundraise on it and get votes on it on both sides. So it was like a complete win, just overall in the political landscape, to have an unproductive conversation about technology.
Well, when speaking about unproductive conversations about technology, did anyone watch the hearing in the House Select Committee on the Weaponization of the Federal Government? Katie did. If you didn't, that one's worth kind of going back and looking out. There was another House hearing on the Twitter files, part 1, led by Jim Jordan. It is actually interesting if you want to kind of get a flavor of what's happening in the kind of MAGA cinematic universe when it comes to tech issues. Go and look at those hearings, and the conversation's very different from the conversation largely that will be happening here today. It's a very different type of discourse, and yet I hate to be like naively optimistic, but I was mentioning to Katie earlier, there isn't a reason why there couldn't be some coming together around some of the questions around transparency and accountability. One of the things that folks on the right are crowing about at the moment, mostly based off the Twitter files and some other concerns, Wuhan lab leak theory, Joe Biden's laptop, et cetera, all kind of mushed together somehow into concerns about government overreach and censorship and things of that nature. I think if we took all the details about those stories that we probably can't necessarily all agree about what actually happened, what didn't, what real facts, what aren't, we might look at it cleanly and clinically and say, actually, these are some of the same concerns. We're worried about the relationship, just like what the consul said earlier. We're worried about the relationship between government and tech platforms. We're worried about power. We're worried about accountability. And if we could look at it clinically, I think we might actually be able to see across the aisle and get something done. But unfortunately, in this country, people would rather get the clip, move on, and fundraise based on those allegations.
Listen, I think there was a lot of value in the techlash and raising awareness around some of these issues. I had a lot of, even though like it frustrated me at moments, and some of it I thought, this is how things move. This is how things normalize. There is reaction and the pendulum swings and swings back, and we're in that process. As we would be with any huge technological change as a society. But one of the things that I think is really interesting right now, particularly, and I love your thoughts on this, is the change in Twitter and everything that's happened in Twitter. So let's admit that Twitter is not, even though it was recently categorized by the EU as a very large online platform, it is not actually anywhere near as large as Facebook or Google or TikTok. But nevertheless, it's 100 million. So people, 300, depending on how many bots there are on any given day. And you had this massive shift in certain communities, and I'm not going to pretend like it was all communities. I think it was maybe in kind of our class of people and our people who are very up on tech issues, people who are very interested in this, of the movement towards decentralization and Mastodon and different types of channels, different types of platforms and servers, modifying how they consumed information. And and this is anecdotal, but one of the things I've just heard so much of from people is the huge loss in centralization. That even if you have set up a pretty decent Mastodon server, a pretty decent following presence, that you're still siloed in a lot of ways from what you're seeing, that they miss a little bit the curation of things and the recommendation process. A friend who's a cognitive scientist recently told me, she's like, I like basically followed 80% of the people I followed were professionals in my area that I wanted to see when they had a new paper or whatever. And now I follow them on the cognitive science professor's paper Mastodon server. But I never check it anymore because the other 20% in Twitter was that I followed, Ellen DeGeneres, and I followed Chrissy Teigen, and I followed all this other stuff in the New York Times, and I followed other things. And actually, it was really fun to consume and see papers next to, I don't know, news of the day and everything else. I mean, if you are looking for a model of what this is like in terms of engaging human beings in consuming both their vegetables and, candy, it's called the newspaper. They literally have like a comic section, and they have, and sports, and they have, this is how you get people to read all of the different things. And so I think it's actually really fascinating to me that it's like, oh, if it's just one type of thing, if there isn't any engagement, people don't actually want to consume it. And so maybe engagement is a public good.
Yeah, this is an interesting conversation. I've given a lot of room at Tech Policy Press to people who are thinking about centralization, decentralization, federation, metaverses, all the rest of that stuff. And kind of, really kind of intellectually thinking through different models of how interaction could occur on the social internet. And, there are a lot of great ideas out there. And I think a lot of people, how many of you started a Mastodon account? Okay. And how many of you are still using it regularly? Fascinating.
Yeah. Jeff.
How many of you are on Twitter? Okay, good number of you. How many of you, even though you're maybe deeply frustrated, you keep going back, hoping to get a fix? Okay. There's something to it. And something that occurred.
How many people are here? Do we have an adequate sample size?
There you go. This is science. But I'll just say, one of the things that went on when Elon, completed his acquisition, and I tried to give a bit of room to at Tech Policy Press and hear different voices on, was the sort of feeling among folks who felt they had invested a great deal into Black Twitter, which is known as one of the more substantial kind of subaltern counter publics that formed on Twitter, if you will. And there was a lot of mourning in that community about the loss of the opportunity to kind of, make sense of things in that environment, to have the opportunity to use the power that had been essentially created there. And there was a real sense that that power and that community had been formed, not because Twitter had helped them do it, but because in spite of Twitter, these individuals had invested huge amounts of time and effort into creating these networks, into curating their own feeds, into making their own networks. And I have to say, I found that same response, not just from folks who talked to me who had played a role in that in Black Twitter, but also folks from different dissident communities around the world, different human rights groups, certainly academic communities that had built up those networks over the years. And there was a real sense of something real has been lost here. I have lost something. I certainly feel it every day. I go there looking for the fix, and I don't find it in quite the same way, right? I used to see Jamil there more often. For some reason, I don't see him that often anymore.
Strong dying mall vibes.
Yeah, very definitely strong dying mall. Although people did get excited about the presidential mullets. I bet all of you saw that. If you haven't yet, seek that out.
I do think so. I'm more excited. I'm not happy about the layoffs. They've affected huge swaths of people that I know and care about. And I think especially it's been incredibly, incredibly terrible in terms of, like I said, the social planner projects that were happening at the companies. But I do hope okay, so I'm going to ask you for your hot take and I'll give you mine
let's
first,
let's pause here. Elon Musk in the last, 72 hours openly endorsed a blatant racist statement from a person with absolutely objectionable views. And I'm not sure why any of us are still on his.
Who draws cartoons for a living? It's not like he's like some great thinker or something. Right? Anyway, sorry. That's a little elitist, but yes, I know. It's just I do think that there is I do think that there is a little bit of maybe a moment of being like, maybe we shouldn't, maybe there is some good here. And I think for the last 5 years, that is why I'm like, I'm always like, I like always am cautiously optimistic, always. And I feel like I'm just like cautiously optimistic, but in the other slight on the other side of the thing, which is that I'm cautiously optimistic that this will be a huge educational moment for people experientially, that people will feel the loss of things like Twitter, the loss of these communities, this loss of knowledge, this loss of, I have no idea a lot of what's going on in my community and events that are even happening anymore because I'm not on Twitter as much. And kind of take a moment to be like, oh, maybe instead of just kind of like speaking over broadly about regulation, and as Jamil highlighted, the dangers of empowering government against some of these private platforms in various places, but jumping from the frying pan into the fire, then maybe we can have a moment of being like, okay, there are things to preserve here and there are things to change, and we can come up with things that we can all agree on. But I sound very optimistic.
Well, I mean, I know one of the things we wanted to talk about was the DSA in Europe. We have to end now. So we're almost out of time on that.
You're optimistic. Are you optimistic about the DSA in Europe? I know the answer to this question.
So, I mean, it's interesting. We talked about this very briefly, that a lot of folks have in our community, the thing they hold out hope for is that Europe will come to our aid, and that essentially the DSA will allow for the transparency and the access and put these tech CEOs in their place, et cetera. And yet, like one of the things we talked about was the fact that when we talk to people in Silicon Valley, lawyers and they're not necessarily thinking of the DSA as certainly in the near term, any kind of real compliance kind of concern. They're not really terribly afraid of the Europeans at the moment. So we'll see what happens. There's a lot of hope, a lot of hope that Terry Breton's broad shoulders will, maybe bring change, but I'm not so sure.
Yeah, I'm not so sure either. And there are a lot of things coming out of the DSA that serve Europe and don't serve other parts of, and I will just flag that the fact that the majority world is still left out of this conversation, and that it is constantly, frustratingly, a conversation that is always happening, just that is so US centric, or that is EU US centric, is like, also, by the way, Canada lives here. I don't, in North America. And so and they have got some really wonderful regulation that's coming down and that they've been working on that never gets highlighted. So anyways, I just think that this is, hopefully that is something that can happen too.
Yeah, I know. I'll just, I know we're almost out of time. UNESCO, if any of you followed last week, there was a big giant gathering UN hosted in Paris where they were trying to kind of come to some accord around global internet regulation guidelines. And there is a draft that was put forward, and you can go and look at that on the UNESCO site. But the people I talked to who were there, they also kind of reported back a lot of similar kind of good feelings, like let's all do something to change, et cetera. And yet when it came down to it, not a lot of agreement at all about what should be the priorities. And it turns out that this conversation breaks down really, along political, geographic, country by country lines quite often, which, makes you sort of think that perhaps folks will retreat slightly towards putting a lot of hope into the DSA and the type of knock-on effects that legislation might have. And we'll see what happens here. If I had had a chance to ask a journalistic question of Jamil and Nicole, I would have said, interesting design, age-appropriate design code, right? Just passed. There are other states now pushing those things forward in the US. That might be one area. And yet the industry, along with various people who think hard about the First Amendment, pushing hard back on it and saying, this is a gonna fall afoul. This is unconstitutional. What you're doing here, these types of requirements. So we'll see if any of even these state by state bits of regulation are able to hold up.
Thank you for coming to Hot Takes with Kate and Justin.
I love it. Let's give it up for Justin Hendricks and Kate Klonick.